Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Jewish Bazaar. I'm Tony Michels, professor of Jewish history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm here with Dr. Eddy Portnoy of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and specialist in all things Jewish and strange. Unfortunately, Jessica Chaffin can't be here today. She's being arraigned for shoplifting, but she'll be sure to come back to future episodes.
What do you think she stole?
Oh, I know what she stole. She stole several packs of Bubblicious. She
It's
loves
understandable.
She loves bubble gum. We are discussing today the strange world of nasology and the Jewish nose. Eddy, what is nasology?
Well, nasology is a 19th century offshoot of phrenology. If you're not familiar with phrenology, it was a pseudoscience in which people could tell your personality traits according to the shape of the bumps on your head. And it was a relatively common type of predictor of personality types. A lot of psychics use it. Some people will recognize, heads, porcelain heads with all kinds of regions written on them in the offices of psychics. And nasology was a mid 19th century offshoot of phrenology that held that you could tell a person's personality type by the shape of their nose.
Are you suggesting this is not true?
Well, unfortunately, it's one of those things that I wish were true. But unfortunately, I don't think it is. And in fact, the first text on nasology, called Nasology, was written by Eden Warwick in, I believe, 1848. And it's thought generally that the text is actually a parody. It was written to make fun or to satirize phrenology, which had become very popular. And so this writer, Eden Warwick, thought, I'm going to invent this new pseudoscience called nasology, where you can tell people's personality traits by the shape of their nose, and it's going to function along the same lines as phrenology. But unfortunately for Eden Warwick, a lot of people took him seriously, and the satire apparently wasn't extreme enough for people to understand that it was a fraud. And so by the 1880s, you have much larger texts that expand on the phenomenon of nasology. In, I believe, 1880, there's a text by Gustavus Cohen, who expands the whole field of nasology as a kind of legitimate or a seemingly legitimate science. But basically, there are 5 main types of noses in the pseudoscience of nasology. You have the Roman nose, which is aquiline and convex, and it indicates great decision, considerable energy, firmness, and an absence of refinement. Then you have the Greek nose, which is sort of a straight nose. It indicates refinement of character, love for the fine arts, and belles lettres. Person who has the Greek nose is astute. They're crafty.
I can relate to all this.
Right. Also, though, interestingly, they note that if the Greek nose is slightly distended at its end, it indicates a most useful and intellectual of characters.
Yes,
it's also considered. Yeah, it's also considered the highest and most beautiful form which the nasal organ can assume. You also have the cogitative nose, and that is a wide nostriled nose. That indicates a cogitative mind, which has strong powers of thought. People with this type of nose are given to very serious thought and meditation. You also have what's called the mercantile nose, also known as the Hebraic nose. This is also known as a hawk nose, and it indicates considerable shrewdness in worldly matters, a deep insight into character, and facility and turning that insight into profitable account. They also call this the commercial nose. And while it's named for Jews, it is not confined to them. Other people can also have this nose.
Can you give an example?
I might give an example of Tony Michels.
Well, I didn't mean to make this personalized. I mean other groups that might qualify for the mercantile nose.
I would say that's the Tony Michels group.
That's the tone. Okay. I will tell you, since you are making this personal, I will tell you that I once saw a doctor about an ear problem, and the doctor suggested that this problem might be compounded by what he called my Semitic nose.
No, I think that is this category. I think you must have gone to a nasologist.
I don't know. I didn't see any certification from a school or institute of nasology, but so I can't comment on his professional training. But that was his professional diagnosis.
Wow, interesting.
In the early years of nasology, was there a Semitic category?
Well, that's this category, the Semitic, the so-called Semitic category, or the Hebraic nose, mercantile nose, commercial nose. It's all sort of wrapped up into the same one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, go on. What are some of the other categories? This is
so the other categories. You have the snub nose and the celestial nose. These are categories 5 and 6, and these are indicative of natural weakness, mean and or disagreeable dispositions, and petty insolence. Basically, poverty of character.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the difference between them is the celestial nose has a slightly greater length than the snub nose. And this is something that causes the bearer to have at least a share of fox-like common sense. And it's considered to be more impudent than the snub nose. And the snub nose is considered to be proof of the degeneracy of the human race.
The entire race.
This is from the text, the nasology, the actual nasology text.
You're talking about the satirical text.
Yes, but the content of the satirical text subsequently became the same content for the ostensibly authentic texts.
So
where the text that took it seriously.
Where was this research conducted? Once Warwick published his satirical text, where was the research conducted? In laboratories?
Well,
is this like Ghostbusters? I mean, it sounds like Ghostbusters.
I think it may be like Ghostbusters. Unfortunately, I think there were no laboratories, or, as I like to say, laboratories.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
They this was a text that was just taken from Warwick by people who either didn't understand that it was a satire or didn't care, and appropriated it for their own uses. So I would say that people in the field of clairvoyancy and people who are psychics took this on as sort of an addendum to work they were doing in phrenology.
So
in addition to the fact that you
no, by all means, continue.
Hey, let's bring in the amigos. No, in the I forgot what I was going to say.
I was asking you, where was this research conducted?
All right. Unfortunately, no real research was conducted. I think the text was just taken at face value, and phrenologists simply used it as an addendum to their continuing work in phrenology. If someone came into your office to have their personality traits read according to the bumps on their head, the phrenologist might say, well, hey, you also have a Greek nose or a Roman nose or a mercantile nose, and you have these traits as well. So I think that's how it happened. And then, some of these people wrote subsequent texts that were based on Warwick's satire, but that took it seriously.
Let's talk about Mr. Cohen, who was one of the early authors of was one of the early nasologists. I think you said that.
Right.
Who is? I gather Mr. Cohen was Jewish.
Mr. Cohen does. He does seem Jewish.
And wait. What country does he live in? Is it the U.S., Germany?
Cohen lives in London.
London. All right.
Or he publishes in London. Um, I could add that he built on Warwick's categories.
Mm-hmm.
He basically plagiarized the original text. But in addition to the categories that I mentioned that Warwick created, Cohen added some categories, including the apprehensive nose, the melancholy nose, the
Mm-hmm.
inquisitive nose,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the combative nose, um, which incidentally has three subcategories: defensive, irritable, and aggressive. And he also categorized the Jewish nose as what he called, and I'm quoting from Gustavus Cohen, the Jewish nose is strictly a combative nose,
Mm-hmm.
receiving its peculiar form principally from an extraordinary development of the sign of apprehension with a relatively smaller inquisitiveness, which gives it a downward and inward tendency at its end. Its dominant commercialism is indicated in its breadth. Um, so this is something that he added. But what's fascinating about this whole phenomenon is that uh, the general press took some of this material and kind of ran with it as if nasology was legitimate science. So there are articles in magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, which produced an article that considered nasology a perfectly legitimate science.
The latest thing in science, nasology. But I want to go back to Gustavus Cohen.
Right. I have to say that not much is known about Gustavus Cohen.
Okay. Well, then tell
Uh,
us what you can about him. I mean, I
I,
would
I,
think
I
that.
can't tell you much other than he
Uh,
was he was someone involved in the field of phrenology who saw this nasology text and decided that this was a worthy endeavor to build on, which he did. So he
is
published
is
nasology.
Cohen a self-hating Jew? Why would a Jew engage in?
I think to a certain degree he may have been.
Because he seems to accept and actually elaborate on, in unflattering terms, the idea of a Jewish nose.
Correct.
Not only that it exists as such, but is offensive.
Right. Right. That it's in some way problematic.
Uh
That's
huh.
that's that's correct. And I
When
think that,
does
that to a certain degree, a lot of Jews felt that the Jewish nose was, or the so-called, let's say, Jewish nose was problematic to the point where uh, one of the first rhinoplasties of the modern era took place uh, in Germany.
mm-hmm.
Uh, it was performed by a German doctor on a German Jew, who and the doctor was helping to cure this Jew of the illness of looking Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Illness was a word used by whom?
Um, I believe it was used by Sandra Gilman in describing this whole matter. But
Uh-huh.
that's the basic sense of this whole thing, that looking this way, having a large nose was not only was it attributed to quote unquote looking Jewish, but it was problematic. It wasn't a look that was considered part of normative beauty in this place and time.
The timing is not incidental. That this is happening in the second half of the 19th century because it's a time when Jews are integrating into whichever countries they're living into, or living in, or at least trying to. They're achieving equal rights in some countries, they're being emancipated, and they're integrating into the larger societies, often with difficulty. In the German case, with a great deal of difficulty, it took decades for Jews to achieve full emancipation, as equal citizens. And in part of that process, Jews had to, well, it was a struggle to fit in, and part of
Yeah,
fitting in is looking like the majority.
absolutely. I mean, Jews, in the late 18th century, most German Jews still spoke Yiddish.
Mhm.
They still dressed in traditional Jewish clothing, and they really weren't particularly well integrated into German society. But there were some who were trying, and they were trying to the point where they sort of denuded themselves of traditional Jewish clothing and wore, what Germans were wearing at the time. They strove to speak Yiddish instead of German, and many of them, there was actually a wave of conversions to Christianity, just so Jews could assimilate and to join German society. And one of the interesting aspects to that is by the mid 19th century, when because of advancements in printing technologies, you had a large increase in the number of magazines and newspapers. Caricatures of Jews became particularly popular. And what's fascinating here is in many of these caricatures, Jews are dressed in German clothing. And in a way, their clothing, the way they look, the way they're clothed, they're not distinguishable from Germans. And what the caricatures do to make Jews distinguishable from Germans is to give them huge noses. And so that becomes the most identifying feature of the Jew, this nose, in spite of the fact that, most Jews probably didn't have noses like this, but certainly some did. But that this nose as a symbolic feature becomes predominant in imagery of Jews at this time.
Again, another important thing about the timing is the beginning of this is around the time of eugenics and
Yeah,
right, and various kinds of pseudoscience, scientific theories about race,
right.
where people are trying to classify humanity by races and attributing behavior, mental capacities, all kinds of things to alleged racial origins. So, this I see. It seems to me that nasology is part and parcel of the larger
Oh,
study of
absolutely.
race in these.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting and odd things is that these categories of race stuck, uh, even though they're not accurate. Uh, but things like nasology and phrenology disappeared because they're obviously ridiculous. And so it's interesting to note that what survived this period scientifically, or even in the popular realm, as a way to categorize and look at people.
Mhm.
Um, sort of like phrenology and nasology disappear, whereas race remains as a way to categorize people.
But even if nasology disappeared, the idea of a Jewish nose never disappeared. I mean, it
No,
still exists to this day. That
that
one distinguishing physical trait of Jews is their nose.
right. As much as Jews dislike this phenomenon, this is something that seems eternal. It never goes away. Um, and even though it's funny, in the first decade of the 20th century, a Columbia University anthropology student by the name of Morris Fishberg wrote a dissertation called "The Jew: A Study in Race." I think it's just a study in race. I can't remember the exact title, but it's the Jew.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a study of race and ethnography or anthropology. Um, and he took about 5,000, he interviewed 5,000 Jewish immigrants in New York from all different places, and actually measured their noses. He measured everything. He measured their height, weight, all kinds of things. But one of the things that he also measured was their noses, and he determined that only about 15% of Jews actually had what was considered to be a Jewish nose, which is a small percentage.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but in the popular imagination, it's something that stuck and is still with us today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, how did Jews react to all this?
Jews are very unhappy about this,
Except for Cohen in London.
except for Cohen. Right, Cohen was thrilled. No, Jews are generally very unhappy about this, but what aren't Jews unhappy about? They're always going no. So they there's no real way, other than the fact that I said that one of the first modern rhinoplasties was performed on a Jew by a Jew, for the so-called disease of looking Jewish. Nose jobs become very popular
Mm-hmm.
in a certain time and place in the United States. Um, it's having a Jewish nose is something that's considered not attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I don't know if we're past that. But Jews don't appreciate it. Actually, to this day, when I give lectures on caricatures of the Yiddish press, many of which, Yiddish in the Yiddish press, caricaturists appropriated this sort of image of the Jew with a large nose and curly black hair. Um,
But of course, it had a different meaning in the Yiddish press.
right. Well, in the Yiddish press is obviously none. It's not anti-Semitic. It's the entire phenomenon is pro-Jewish phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
They're just using these figures to distinguish Jews from other ethnic groups, and they don't necessarily have a problem with it. They realize that this image of the Jew isn't necessarily something of their creation, but they accept it as something that's not necessarily negative.
Mm.
Um,
They're already going back to rhinoplasty. There's an image. There's a cartoon that ran in the humor magazine Puck in New York City, and the cartoon is about the exclusion of Jews from clubs, beach clubs. In this particular instance, Jews were excluded from something called the Manhattan Beach Club. It was in the
what
1870s.
1870s? This early?
1870s. It's pretty early,
Wow.
yeah. And it's in the 1870s. And Jews, the owner of the club had announced that Jews were no longer going to be allowed in the club because Gentiles don't like them. And so he has to honor the preferences of his clientele. And he announced in the New York Times or other newspapers that Jews would no longer be permitted. And so Puck published a piece, a cartoon, saying the caption was what the Jews would have to do to get admitted into the Manhattan Beach Club. And you see in one corner a line of Jews waiting to get their noses hacked off by a guillotine. And there's a picture of a guy with his nose at the bottom of the guillotine and the blade's about to come down. It's an early, it anticipates early on rhinoplasty.
Yeah, and what? Okay, you. I think I've seen this image, and there's something about the hair as well.
Yes, there's another in this cartoon. There's an additional contraption designed to straighten the hair of Jews, and it shows a Jewish man with curly hair hanging from this contraption. It's designed to straighten the hair. That's how you'd straighten your hair, by hanging from like a clamp that would, and so you would dangle from the clamp, and your hair would stretch out until it's straight. That was the idea in this cartoon.
Right.
But there are all sorts of other images. Almost all the Jews depicted in this picture have oversized nose, grotesque noses. The men are dressed as women. The women look like men. The whole idea is that Jews are grotesque and ugly.
Right. I mean that's the ultimate purpose of anti-Semitic caricature.
Yeah, yeah. And so the nose job comes along and provides a way out for Jews who can afford it or want it.
Right. But does something like that actually help?
Right.
I mean, maybe for the self-image of the person who's doing it.
Well, later on, in a later point in time, I'd say by the 1960s, 1970s, a nose job becomes a stereotype of Jewish girls.
Yeah.
It becomes a marker of Jewishness is a nose job. Or as
Right.
Jews would say, getting their noses fixed.
Right. Right. And considering it's ironic considering the original intention was just to fit in.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But it becomes evident that it didn't really work.
That just say as an aside, that fits a pattern where, over the last couple hundred years, Jews have done many things to try to fit in somehow, but their efforts usually or often become reinscribed on Jews as a marker of Jewish difference. So, take communism. Communism was a way for many Jews to fit into some larger movement or community of humanity, and but it just generates a stereotype of the Jew communist or the Jew Bolshevik, where that becomes associated with the Jew or tainted by that association with Jews. The nose job was, I think, something similar. Became a stereotype. That middle class Jews on Long Island or in Los Angeles, what do? They get nose jobs. It's just a sign of
Right.
their Jewishness
Right. And there's no getting away from the Jews and their taints.
and their taints. Um, uh, so, the where do we want to go with this?
I mean, you could say that a lot of this leads into the idea that there's a particularistic Jewish look
Mhm.
that's, I guess, attributed to Ashkenazi Jews in Europe and in the United States, and it doesn't correspond to popular norms of beauty,
Mhm.
and it's perceived in a negative way, and Jews internalize that and deal with it in a variety of
It
different
has some
ways.
big effects. Well, what are those standards of beauty? They're straight hair, blonde, light eyes, fair skin.
Right. It's to
Those
the point
are
where I think a Jewish woman created the Barbie doll,
yes,
which
that's right.
which which, rep, which represents all of those
A
characteristics.
kind of fantastic representation of what an ideal beauty was. The I mean, I think today we'd use the term white supremacist, that the standard of beauty upheld, uh, standard of beauty associated with Northern Europeans, and to some degree, defined almost an opposition to people who didn't fit that. Jews were one of them.
Right. Right. And
African Americans are another.
right, exactly. And this just brought to mind something I once wrote on in Warsaw in 1929. A Polish language Jewish newspaper held a beauty pageant to choose the most beautiful Jewish girl in Poland. And they created this pageant because they realized that a Jewish girl would never win a Miss Poland contest.
Mm-hmm.
And so they decided.
Because the Jewish girl, the presumption is the Jewish girl didn't fit the standards, didn't look right, and couldn't win a general
Right.
Polish. Yeah. Right.
Right, exactly. There was a clear differentiation in a particular look. Poles were light and blonde, and Jews were dark and curly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one interesting thing in some of the articles that accompany this beauty pageant, there are articles that written by artists and photographers about what is Jewish beauty, and they conclude that what they actually call a Sephardic style beauty is the best and most Jewish form of beauty, and this would be someone who's darker with dark hair, darker skin, and in fact, the woman who wins the pageant has long black hair and olive skin.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting that was the look that they wanted. Instead of having a beauty pageant where they chose a kind of classic Northern European
Mm-hmm.
style beauty, they chose what they felt was a distinctly Jewish form of beauty.
Who were the organizers? Were they Zionists?
In fact, they were.
Yeah.
The newspaper that ran this pageant was called Nasz Przegląd, which means our review. It was a daily newspaper for the Jewish community, written in Polish, but the newspaper itself was they had a general Zionist orientation.
So it's an example of Jews trying to define their own standards of beauty on what they think of as Jewish
Right,
characteristics.
right,
You
rather
see
than to allow outsiders to define it.
you see similar things in the Black community in the United States.
Yeah,
Um, um, I was just going to say, along those lines, if you look at if you look at it in the Jewish press in the United States way back when, you'd see advertisements for
yeah,
skin whitener. Sorry, which are also
yeah.
sold in the Black press.
This is interesting. So in the Yiddish press, and you have this in the general press to a certain degree as well, but in the Yiddish press, you have advertisements for products these kinds of masks that you could put on your face that will change the shape of your nose.
Hmm.
And there's sort of little cartoons that accompany them, or little line drawings that accompany them, that are like before and after images. And the before image is someone with like a gigantic nose,
Hmm.
and the after image is sort of just a more sort of like a smaller aquiline nose, as if these products actually worked.
Hmm.
They didn't. Um, I believe there's one of these products in Evo's archives.
I'd love to see one of those. I'd love to see one.
I
I'd
can
never
arrange. I
seen
can
it
arrange for
before.
you to. I can arrange for you to try it.
I'd like to try. Am I too old for this to work,
No, I
or
think
do
you're
you have
never.
to do
You're
it at a
you.
young formative age?
I don't think you're ever too old. I don't think that there are any age restrictions on this product.
Here's an idea. Someone should go through every high school. Someone should go through high school yearbooks of the last 50, 70, 80 years to see if any Jew won the cutest award. You know how high schools have these elections? Who's cutest, best looking, best
Wait,
body?
those things appear in yearbooks?
It did where I grew up, and I presume elsewhere. And to see if a Jew was ever voted cutest, best, or best looking. I,
Well,
I,
what,
I,
what were you voted?
I was not voted into anything.
That
Oh, I
that's
was
so
voted. I actually take
that's
that back.
see,
In seventh grade, I was voted funniest of my seventh grade class,
okay,
which but that's an acceptable Jewish category.
yes, absolutely.
Smartest or funniest were categories populated by Jews across the ages.
Yeah, that's a good that's a good potential project. I think you should suggest it to Nathaniel.
I will do that. Let's go from ugly to the perverted.
Wait, you know what? Before we get to the
Yeah.
perverted, um, because I don't think Jews are ugly. I think Jews are awesome. Um, I just wanted to mention that there was a Yiddish artist and writer by the name of Yossel Kotler who wrote a very nice children's song about noses. And he himself did not have what you'd call a traditional Jewish nose. He had what you'd call a Kronosa Nesel in Yiddish, which means sort of it's sort of a smaller nose, a smaller, almost a ski jump nose. And he wrote a song that claimed that if you're a child and you drink a lot of milk, you'll grow up to be healthy and you'll have a big, beautiful nose. Uh, and but if when you're a child you only drink a little bit of milk, you'll grow up to have a Kronosenesel, or a small nose.
Mhm.
And if you grow up without drinking any milk at all, you'll grow up with absolutely no nose at all. And so he sort of inverted this whole story. Whereas if you should grow up to if you grow up drinking milk, you'll be strong and healthy. But his view, his version of that is that you'll have a nice big nose,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that's a form of being healthy.
Uh-huh.
But if you don't drink milk, you'll be unhealthy and you won't even have a nose.
Uh-huh.
So
Very
it's kind of a
interesting.
nice Yiddish inversion of
Inversion
this
and
whole sordid
affirmation.
affair.
Well,
All right,
speaking of
back to let's go back to your perversions.
Well, I was going to say, and speaking of sordid, I'm reminded of the Leo Frank affair of 1915 in Atlanta, Georgia. Of course, that's the incident involving Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager. I think it was a pencil
Pencil
factory. Yeah,
factory
pencil
manager.
factory. He didn't own it. He was just the manager. And he was falsely accused of raping and murdering a young, I believe, 13-year-old Gentile employee. She was found murdered, and he was accused and convicted, although his sentence was later commuted. In any case, he was a lynch mob, broke him out of prison and lynched him, resulting in I don't know resulting directly in the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia. Half the city's Jewish community, half the city's Jewish community fled Atlanta. It was a big deal, but the press was covered this all over the place, and there was this incredible hysteria around Leo Frank, and there were suggestions that Leo Frank used his oversized nose for sexually perverted acts. So there you see again. You can use your imagination.
I got to say,
Uh,
I'm in full support of that.
you're well. Too bad you weren't an editorial writer in Atlanta in 1915. I think you would have had a lot of support. But in any case, it's just an example of where the
Right,
idea of the Jewish
exactly.
nose figures
Right.
in a pretty serious way.
Well, this is interesting because it's in the Arabic press, in particular during the 1967 Six Day War, they produced a lot of caricatures related to
Yeah,
Israel.
yeah.
And so what's interesting here, there are a lot of caricatures of Nasser,
Hmm.
of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt, as a very heroic figure.
Hmm.
So Nasser had a pretty big nose, and caricaturists caricatured him with a pretty big nose.
Hmm.
But when they caricatured Jewish figures representing Israel next to him, they changed the Jewish nose to a kind of long, droopy nose that
Yeah,
looks like a dick.
yeah.
And that's how they differentiate. That's how those characters differentiated,
Hmm.
um, this I guess Semitic nose, this sort of Middle Eastern or
Well,
Mediterranean nose that Greeks, Italians, North Africans all share with Jews, um, but it's more attributable to Jews. But in order to differentiate the Jewish big nose from
it was shaped differently and
right,
in a way
it was shaped like a
unattractive.
penis, shaped like a
Yeah.
penis.
Uh-huh.
Um, so that that's an interesting connection with Leo Frank's
Hmm.
with the story surrounding Leo Frank that this
Do you know anything about the cartoonists in the major Egyptian or Syrian papers?
during that period I don't know anything about those
Uh,
particular cartoonists, but it's a relatively common trope in all of those in all of the
hmm.
general Arab,
Yeah,
whether it's Syria or Egypt.
I've seen some of those cartoons, and to some degree, they don't differ at all from what you see in the European press. In an earlier period, prior to the 1960s, prior to World War II, between the 19th and 20th century, the characters of Jews in the European or American press we've been talking about appear in a new context in Arab language newspapers.
Right. Well, what's interesting is when European newspapers caricature, at least in the 19th early 20th centuries, when they caricature Arabs, the noses are virtually the same as the noses they use for Jewish caricature, but the difference in the type of caricature is that the Arabs are generally caricatured as savages,
Hmm.
whereas the Jewish body is caricatured as sort of weak
Hmm.
and they'll
Degenerate.
show like a Turk, you know, or an Arab, coming forward with a sword and in traditional dress, with you know frothing at the mouth, maybe with fangs and a big nose, whereas they show the Jew, with a sort of weak,
Hmm.
pitiful, diseased body,
Hmm.
um, but also with a big nose, and it's very similar to the way what they
So
use for
noses
the
are
Arabs.
similar, but one people are shown to be robust, or
Yes,
and the other degenerated.
right.
In the case of the Jews, um, what is the legacy of all this? As I'm wondering, I mean, clearly there are legacies that continue well past the defeat of Nazism.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the Nazis use this sort of figurative language frequently, but it's still common. It's a very common trope on the internet. There's a caricature of a Jew with a huge nose and a beard rubbing his hands together, that you can find pretty frequently. All over the internet. As part of anti-Semitic discourse. This is something that hasn't disappeared at all. In spite of the fact that, I mean, in the realm of sort of professional cartooning and caricature, this is something that generally isn't done anymore. People are aware, cartoonists and caricaturists are aware that these negative physical tropes have been harmful, and they've stopped doing them. They still remain, however, among racist cartoonists and caricaturists who still exist and still produce work. And it's commonly, and because of the internet and the ease with which things are disseminated, you can find this type of material all over the place. But any kind of official news outlet, they tend to shy away from from these types of caricatures.
What
But you'll
about yeah?
no, go ahead.
What about in caricatures regarding Israel?
Well, I think that when cartoonists in the West assiduously avoid caricaturing Israelis as as traditional looking, as traditional caricature had them. They, on the other hand, in the Arab world, anti-Jewish caricature retains these physical tropes. They in the Arab world, caricatures involving Israel often, or at least the ones that I've seen, often have huge noses and degenerate bodies, and they've sort of the certain caricaturists in that world have maintained the traditional European anti-Semitic tropes.
Do you think Nasology will ever make a comeback?
I hope it does, because I'm looking for a job.
Well, I think you're well qualified to be a specialist in nasology, or a specialist on specialists in nasology, and I think that's what we've learned here.
That's a good meta job to have.
I think you've established yourself here on this podcast today.
You're a very kind young man, Tony Michels.
Well, I try to be generous. It's fits the profile of the mercantile Jew, doesn't it?
It might.
It might. We'll have to return to one of Cohen's studies.
As long as you're able to make a profit.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I'm Tony Michels.
I'm Eddy Portnoy, and I'd like to thank the amazing Jonathan London. He's a hero, that guy.
He is a hero.
Check out Geekscape.
What is Geekscape?
It's an incredible website full of podcasts and movies and comics.
Hey,
it might be.
Producer Jonathan here, just to say hi. That is not necessary. But if you do like this podcast and you're into pop culture podcasts covering movies and music and pro wrestling and comic books, your kids might like it. Search for Geekscape on your favorite podcatcher. And you'll learn a little more about Spider-Man and that kind of thing.
What could be bad?
Back to the show, though.
Until next time, take care, everybody.
All right, have fun.